The people of Pine Knot Hollow always said the mountains kept their secrets, and if you lived long enough among the ridges and dark timber, you learned not to ask too many questions. The hollow sat deep within a maze of Appalachian valleys where the sun arrived late each morning and disappeared early behind the black shoulders of the mountains. A narrow dirt road wound through the settlement, passing weathered cabins built from chestnut logs, their chimneys breathing smoke into the cold air. Most families who lived there farmed small patches of land, hunted deer in the autumn, and survived the hard winters through stubbornness more than comfort. Yet among all the stories told around hearth fires and on creaking front porches, none was stranger than the tale of the widows who never slept at night. Travelers first noticed it. They would arrive near sunset, hoping for shelter before continuing through the mountains, and they would see something unusual. As darkness settled over Pine Knot Hollow, every lamp inside every cabin eventually went dark except for a cluster of homes near the northern edge of the settlement. There, long after midnight, lights remained burning behind curtained windows. The women who lived in those cabins were all widows. Their husbands had died over the years under circumstances that people preferred not to discuss. Some had vanished while hunting. Some were found dead in ravines. Others disappeared entirely without leaving a trace. What unsettled outsiders was not merely that these women stayed awake. It was what they did during those long hours of darkness. Night after night, they gathered together beside the old road leading toward the forest. They stood silently in a line facing the trees. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply watched the darkness. Children were warned never to approach them after sunset. Men who mocked the practice soon stopped laughing once they learned the history behind it. The story began nearly 70 years earlier, when Pine Knot Hollow consisted of only a handful of cabins scattered along the creek. In those days, a young woman named Martha Quinn arrived with her husband Elijah. They built a cabin near the edge of the settlement and quickly became respected members of the community. Elijah was a skilled hunter who often disappeared into the mountains for days at a time. Martha managed their small farm and became known for her kindness. For several years, life seemed ordinary. Then one autumn evening, Elijah failed to return from a hunting trip. Such delays were not uncommon, so Martha waited patiently. When 3 days passed, several men organized a search party. They followed Elijah's trail deep into the mountains until they reached a narrow valley few people entered willingly. The valley was called Dead Man's Run. Local Cherokee legends claimed something ancient lived there long before settlers arrived. Most residents dismissed such stories as superstition. Nevertheless, they avoided the place whenever possible. The search party found Elijah's rifle leaning against a tree. Nearby lay his pack and hunting knife. Everything appeared untouched. Yet Elijah himself was nowhere to be found. Searchers combed the valley for 2 days without discovering any sign of him. It was as though he had simply vanished in a thin air. Martha mourned her husband and eventually accepted that he was gone forever. But several weeks later, she began experiencing strange events. Each night shortly after midnight, she heard footsteps circling her cabin. The footsteps moved slowly and deliberately, crunching across leaves and gravel. Whenever she looked outside, she saw nothing. At first, she believed grief was affecting her mind. Then the knocking began. 3 slow knocks on the cabin wall. Always the same pattern. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. The sound occurred every night. Martha became terrified. She asked neighbors for help. Several men agreed to spend the night watching outside her cabin. Around midnight, they heard the footsteps too. They heard the knocking, yet they saw no person responsible. By dawn, the sound stopped. The men searched the area and discovered a series of footprints circling the cabin. The tracks resembled those of a man, but each footprint appeared strangely elongated, almost stretched. The discovery unsettled everyone. Over the following months, other residents reported hearing similar noises near their homes. Livestock disappeared. Dogs refused to enter certain parts of the forest. Then, one bitter winter night, another hunter vanished. His name was Samuel Hodge. Like Elijah Quinn, He left behind his belongings, but no body was ever found. Samuel's widow, Rebecca, soon began hearing the same footsteps around her cabin. She also reported seeing a figure standing among the trees at night. The figure appeared human, but unnaturally tall. It never approached. It simply watched. Rebecca shared her experiences with Martha, and the two women realized the similarities were impossible to ignore. They began spending evenings together for comfort. Before long, a third widow joined them, then a fourth. Each had lost a husband under mysterious circumstances. Each heard footsteps after dark. Each claimed to see the watcher standing beyond the edge of the woods. The women developed a habit. Rather than hiding inside their cabins, they gathered outdoors after sunset. They built lanterns and stood together facing the forest. Oddly enough, the footsteps ceased whenever they did this. The watcher never appeared. The nights remained quiet. Word of the practice spread throughout Pine Knot Hollow. Some believed the women were imagining things. Others suspected a flesh and blood killer lurked in the mountains. But no evidence ever surfaced. Years passed. New families arrived. Older residents died. Yet the strange disappearances continued. Every decade seemed to claim several more men. Always hunters. Always alone. Always near Dead Man's Run. And every time a new widow appeared, she eventually joined the nighttime gatherings. The tradition became so common that people stopped questioning it. Children grew up seeing the women standing silently beside the road. They accepted it as a normal part of life. However, few knew what the widows discussed among themselves. They shared stories never spoken publicly. Stories of dreams. Every widow experienced the same dream shortly after her husband vanished. In the dream, she walked through the forest beneath a moonless sky. She followed distant footsteps until reaching a clearing filled with mist. There stood her husband facing away from her. No matter how loudly she called, he never turned around. Then another figure emerged from the darkness behind him. The figure towered over the trees. Its shape resembled a man draped in shadows, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms hung too long. Its head seemed tilted at an unnatural angle. The creature placed one hand upon the husband's shoulder. At that moment, he slowly walked away into the mist and disappeared forever. Then the figure turned toward the widow. Though its face remained hidden, every woman described the same overwhelming sensation. It was watching her, studying her, remembering her. The dream always ended the same way. The creature whispered a single sentence. "Stay awake." The widows never shared these details with the rest of the settlement. They feared ridicule. Yet as decades passed and more women reported identical dreams, they became convinced something connected them all. The warning haunted them. Stay awake. What did it mean? None could answer. Then came the summer of 1891, the year everything changed. A young schoolteacher named Clara Whitlock arrived in Pine Knot Hollow. Unlike most residents, Clara possessed a curious mind and little patience for superstition. When she heard stories about the widows, she dismissed them as folklore created to explain old tragedies. She rented a room from Martha Quinn, now an elderly woman whose hair had turned completely white. Clara noticed immediately that Martha never slept during the night. Instead, she spent hours sitting beside a window facing the forest. One evening, Clara finally asked why. Martha studied her for several moments before answering. "Because if we sleep," she said quietly, "it comes closer." Clara laughed politely, assuming the old woman was joking. Martha did not laugh. The seriousness in her eyes sent a chill through the young teacher. During the following weeks, Clara became increasingly fascinated by the mystery. She interviewed residents and recorded their stories in a journal. The accounts varied in detail, but shared remarkable similarities. Footsteps, knocking, dreams, watchers in the woods, missing men. Most intriguing of all was the consistency across generations. The same stories had persisted for nearly 70 years. One night, Clara decided to conduct her own investigation. Shortly before midnight, she slipped from Martha's cabin and followed the road toward the gathering place where the widows stood each night. A dozen women had assembled beneath the stars. Lantern light flickered across their solemn faces. None appeared surprised to see her. Martha merely nodded and motioned for Clara to stay. After seeing the footprint beside the road, Clara Whitlock could no longer dismiss the stories of Pine Knot Hollow as simple mountain folklore. Throughout the following days, she searched every account she could find. She spoke with elderly residents, examined church records, and even traveled to neighboring settlements, hoping someone might know more about the strange disappearances. What she discovered only deepened the mystery. The earliest written mention of the phenomenon appeared in a faded journal dating back to 1819. A traveling preacher described arriving at a remote mountain community where several women remained awake all night, standing watch along the edge of the forest. According to his account, they claimed an entity wandered the mountains seeking lonely men. The preacher dismissed the story as superstition, but he noted something unsettling. 2 days after leaving the settlement, one of his companions vanished while hunting. No trace of the man was ever found. Clara copied every detail into her notebook. The pattern stretched back much farther than anyone had realized. Yet one question remained unanswered. What exactly were the widows watching for? Late one evening, she returned to Martha Quinn's cabin and confronted the old woman directly. Martha listened silently before opening a small wooden chest hidden beneath her bed. Inside were dozens of journals collected over many decades. Some belonged to widows who had died long ago. Others contained handwritten notes passed down through generations. Martha placed the journals on the table. "Everything we know is in these pages," she said. Clara spent the entire night reading. The entries revealed a horrifying consistency. Every widow described hearing footsteps after her husband disappeared. Every widow reported dreams of the towering figure. Every widow eventually learned something else. The figure did not merely watch. It waited. Several journals described nights when widows accidentally fell asleep before dawn. Whenever this happened, they awoke to find strange marks around their homes. Deep scratches appeared on doors. Footprints circled the cabins. Livestock vanished. One woman claimed she awoke to discover muddy handprints covering her bedroom wall. Another reported hearing breathing beside her bed while she slept. Yet the most disturbing account came from a widow named Abigail Turner. According to her journal, she ignored the warning and spent several nights sleeping normally. On the third night, she awoke standing in the forest several miles from home with no memory of how she arrived there. The ground around her was covered with elongated footprints. After that experience, she never slept through the night again. Clara closed the journal with trembling hands. "Why tell no one?" she asked. Martha stared toward the dark window. "Because those who learn too much become part of the story." The old woman's answer lingered in Clara's mind. A week later, another disappearance struck the hollow. A young hunter named Daniel Mercer failed to return from a routine trip into the mountains. Search parties combed the ridges for days. They found his rifle, pack, and boots neatly arranged beside a stream in Dead Man's Run. Daniel himself had vanished. His wife, Eleanor, became the newest widow of Pine Knot Hollow. Within days, she reported hearing footsteps around her cabin. The cycle had begun again. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara convinced several men from the settlement to accompany her into Dead Man's Run. Most refused at first, but curiosity and pride eventually overcame their fear. Early one morning, the group entered the valley. Massive hemlocks blocked much of the sunlight. Strange silence hung over the forest. No bird sang. No squirrels rustled through leaves. Even the wind seemed absent. The deeper they traveled, the more uneasy everyone became. Around midday, they discovered something unusual carved into a stone outcropping. The symbol resembled a circle surrounding a pair of elongated footprints. Nearby stood dozens of smaller carvings weathered by centuries of rain and snow. Clara carefully sketched the markings. One of the older men recognized them immediately. Local Cherokee stories spoke of a being called the Walker between shadows, an ancient presence that lured travelers away from the living world. According to legend, the creature could not force someone to follow it. Instead, it slowly wore down its victims through dreams, whispers, and fear until they willingly crossed into its realm. the widow's dreams suddenly seemed far more significant. As evening approached, the search party reached the deepest section of Dead Man's Run. There they found a clearing unlike anything Clara had ever seen. Hundreds of dead trees stood in perfect silence. The earth appeared gray and lifeless. At the center rose a massive stone formation resembling a doorway. Though clearly natural, its shape looked disturbingly intentional. Clara approached cautiously. The moment she touched the stone, a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her. Images flashed through her mind. Men walking into the mist. Shadowy figures watching from between trees. Endless rows of lanterns glowing in darkness. Then she heard a voice. The same words described in every widow's dream. "Stay awake." Clara staggered backward. The others noticed her distress and immediately insisted they leave. As they retreated from the clearing, darkness descended unusually fast. The forest seemed determined to swallow the remaining daylight. Then came footsteps. Not one set, dozens. Slow crunching sounds echoed from every direction. Panic spread through the group. Lanterns shook in trembling hands. The footsteps grew louder, closer, yet no figures appeared among the trees. Suddenly, one of the men screamed. He pointed into the darkness ahead. Clara followed his gaze and felt her blood freeze. Standing between two massive hemlocks was a silhouette at least 9 feet tall. Its body appeared wrapped in shadows thicker than the surrounding night. Long arms hung nearly to the ground. Though distant, its presence felt overwhelming. Several men raised rifles. Before anyone could fire, the figure stepped backward and vanished. The footsteps ceased instantly. No one spoke during the journey home. Word of the encounter spread rapidly throughout Pine Knot Hollow. For the first time in decades, even skeptics began believing the widows might be telling the truth. That night, nearly the entire settlement remained awake. Families gathered together. Lanterns burned in every window. The widows took their usual positions facing the forest. Shortly after midnight, an unnatural fog rolled into the hollow. Thick white mist swallowed roads, cabins, and fields. Visibility dropped to only a few yards. Then the knocking began. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 3 more. The sound echoed from every direction at once. Children cried. Dogs hid beneath porches. Men gripped rifles with shaking hands. Clara stood beside Martha and the other widows, watching the darkness beyond the lantern light. Shapes moved within the fog. Tall shapes. Too tall. One silhouette appeared. Then another. Then another. The entire tree line seemed filled with watching figures. Hundreds of dark forms stood motionless beyond the settlement. A wave of terror swept through everyone present. Yet the widows did not retreat. They simply raised their lanterns higher. Martha stepped forward. Though nearly 80 years old, her voice carried clearly through the fog. "You have no place here." For several moments, nothing happened. Then every silhouette took a single step backward. The movement occurred simultaneously, like soldiers obeying a command. Clara stared in disbelief. The figures continued retreating until the fog swallowed them completely. Dawn eventually arrived. The mist vanished. The knocking stopped. Yet everyone understood something had changed. The entity was no longer content watching from a distance. It was becoming bolder. During the following weeks, Clara devoted herself to studying the journals more carefully. Hidden within several accounts, she discovered references to an old ritual once performed by the widows. The ritual had been forgotten over time because no one fully understood its purpose. According to the oldest records, the women originally gathered not merely to stay awake, but to maintain a vigil. As long as the vigil continued, the boundary between worlds remained closed. If the vigil ever ended, the walker between shadows would gain entry into the hollow. Clara shared her discovery with Martha. The old widow nodded solemnly. "That is why we stand watch," she said. "Not for ourselves, for everyone." The realization horrified Clara. For generations, these women had sacrificed every night of their lives protecting the settlement. Most residents viewed them as strange old widows clinging to superstition. In reality, they were guardians. That autumn, Martha Quinn died peacefully at the age of 93. The entire hollow attended her funeral.